The Terran Integration Conference was, by all galactic standards, a monumentally boring affair. Picture, if you will, the most tedious diplomatic gathering you've ever endured, then multiply it by 17 different species, each convinced that particular brand of bureaucratic droning was the pinnacle of civilized discourse. The conference hall of Nexus Prime, a space station so sterile it made medical facilities look cozy, hummed with the collective weight of intergalactic pomposity. At the center of this tedium sat the humans. Poor, adorable humans. The galaxy had spent the better part of 3 standard cycles debating what to do with them, rather like concerned parents discussing a particularly dim child who'd somehow learned to play with fusion reactors. They were cute, these Terrans, with their soft pink skin and their enduring inability to survive in most habitable environments without ridiculous amounts of protective gear. Their military consisted primarily of projectile weapons, as if the galaxy hadn't moved past such primitive concepts several millennia ago. The Krillian delegation occupied the prime position at the conference table, naturally. When you've conquered half the known galaxy through sheer brute force and an unfortunate tendency toward violence, you get the good seats. Ambassador Thexval, their chief representative, was a magnificent specimen of Krillian evolution, 8 feet of chitinous armor, forearms capable of crushing titanium, and a disposition that made rabid wolverines seem cuddly. His species had evolved on a world where the concept of peaceful resolution translated roughly to whoever survives the fight gets to be right. To his left sat the Viridian contingent, tall and graceful as weeping willows, if weeping willows had developed space travel and a superiority complex. Their representative, High Counselor ZYNTH, possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that made poets weep and the kind of condescending smile that made everyone else want to slap her. The Viridians had mastered energy manipulation to such a degree that they considered physical conflict a quaint relic of less evolved species. The Morgathite delegate, General Klaxon, represented a species that had weaponized their entire culture. They'd turned war into an art form, complete with critics and seasonal collections. Everything about them was sharp, their armor, their weapons, their wit, and their tempers. They looked upon the other species with the amused tolerance of professors watching kindergartners attempt calculus. And then there were the humans. Zara Voss sat among her fellow Terran diplomats like a sparrow among peacocks. If sparrows wore sensible pantsuits and carried briefcases full of environmental impact studies. She was unremarkable by human standards, average height, brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, clothes that screamed, "I shop at government-approved retailers." The kind of person who'd disappear in a crowd of 3, which was precisely what made her such an effective diplomat. People underestimated the unremarkable. The galaxy, in its infinite wisdom, had gathered to discuss the Terran problem. Not that they called it that officially, the diplomatic euphemism was integration challenges and protective protocols. But everyone knew what it meant. What do you do with a species too primitive to defend itself but too stubborn to accept proper guardianship? The humans require protection, Ambassador Thexval was saying, his voice carrying the subtle harmonics that indicated mild amusement. In Krillian society, finding something amusing was often the last emotion the subject of that amusement would ever inspire. Their homeworld's gravity has left them fragile, their technology is centuries behind our standards, and their military tactics are. He paused, searching for a diplomatic way to say laughably pathetic. Charmingly antiquated. High Counselor ZYNTH nodded with a kind of gracious agreement that made you want to check your wallet afterward. Indeed, their physical limitations are quite pronounced. During our preliminary assessments, we observed that sustained exposure to standard galactic environmental conditions causes them significant distress. They require supplemental atmosphere, temperature regulation, and gravity adjustment for even basic comfort. General Klaxon leaned forward, his scarred features arranged in what might have been a smile on a species that understood the concept. Their warriors, and I use the term generously, rely on kinetic projectiles and chemical propellants. It's rather like watching children play with sticks while discussing nuclear theory. The human delegation sat quietly through this dissection of their species' inadequacies. This was diplomacy at its finest, being insulted in 7 languages simultaneously while maintaining a pleasant expression. Zara's colleague, Ambassador Chen maintained a kind of false smile that suggested he was mentally calculating the distance to the nearest airlock. Perhaps, Zara interjected mildly, we should discuss the actual integration protocols rather than our apparent shortcomings. The suggestion was met with the kind of patronizing chuckles typically reserved for children who'd just suggested solving world hunger with birthday cake. Thexvol's forearms gestured in what was unmistakably a dismissive wave. Of course, little human, he said, the translator struggling with the Krillian diminutive that roughly translated to adorable but dim pet. We understand your eagerness to contribute. However, these decisions require understanding of complex galactic dynamics that. He trailed off, apparently unable to find a diplomatic way to say are far beyond your tiny primitive brain. The conference continued in this vein for several hours, with each species taking turns to explain why humans needed their particular brand of protection. The Viridians offered to house humanity in specially constructed biodomes. The Morgathi suggested a rotating guardianship program. The Krillians, with characteristic subtlety, recommended that humans be classified as a protected species under galactic conservation law. Through it all, Zara took notes. Careful, methodical notes about who said what, when, and in what tone of barely concealed contempt. Her fellow diplomats shot her occasional worried glances. They'd worked with her long enough to recognize the signs. The gradually tightening grip on her stylus, the almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, the way her smile became fractionally more fixed with each passing insult. The breaking point came during the afternoon session, when the discussion turned to humanity's military capabilities. General Claxon had just finished explaining why human combat doctrine was quaint but ultimately suicidal, when Thexvol decided to elaborate. The human physique is simply not designed for conflict, he declared, warming to his subject. Soft skin, fragile bones, limited strength, they are prey animals that somehow developed intelligence. Remarkable from an evolutionary perspective, tragic from a practical one. He gestured toward Zara with one of his secondary arms. Look at this specimen. Tiny, delicate, probably couldn't lift a standard gravity hammer without assistance. The translator helpfully added that specimen carried connotations of something you'd find in a laboratory jar. Their females are particularly fragile, Thexvol continued, apparently unaware that he was approaching a conversational minefield with all the caution of a drunk tourist. Built for nurturing, not warfare. Admirable in its way, but hardly suited for a galaxy where strength determines survival. Zara's stylus snapped. The sound was small in the vast conference hall, barely audible over the hum of life support systems and the gentle murmur of ongoing insults. But something about that tiny crack of breaking plastic seemed to capture everyone's attention. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Even the environmental systems seemed to pause, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Ambassador Thexvol, Zara said quietly, setting down the remains of her stylus with the careful precision of someone handling explosives. I wonder if you'd care to test that theory. The Krillian's compound eyes fixed on her with the kind of attention predators typically reserved for wounded prey. I beg your pardon. Your assertion about human frailty, Zara continued, rising from her seat with fluid grace. Specifically, your comments regarding female humans. I'm curious whether you'd like to test those assumptions personally. The conference hall fell silent. This was the kind of silence that preceded either diplomatic breakthroughs or interstellar incidents. Given the current trajectory of the conversation, smart money was on the incident. Ambassador Chen reached for his colleague's arm. Zara, perhaps we should. Stay seated, Chen, she said without taking her eyes off Thexvol. Her voice carried a quality that made her fellow diplomats sink back into their chairs without conscious thought. The ambassador and I are having a discussion about human limitations. Thexvol's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his species. He rose to his full imposing height, his chitinous armor gleaming under the conference hall's sterile lighting. 8 feet of evolved killing machine, designed by millions of years of survival of the fittest on a world where second place meant becoming dinner. You wish to demonstrate human combat prowess. He spread his 4 arms wide, each one capable of punching through starship hull plating. Against me. Just a friendly demonstration, Zara agreed, walking around the conference table with the casual gait of someone out for an evening stroll. Nothing formal. call it a cultural exchange. The other delegates watched with a horrified fascination typically reserved for natural disasters and traffic accidents. This was either going to be the shortest fight in galactic history or the beginning of a very awkward incident report. HFY waited until she was within range, then casually swung one of his primary arms toward her. Not a serious attack, more like swatting a particularly annoying insect. Among Krillians, it would have been considered gentle, playful, even. Zara ducked under the swing, stepped inside his reach, and drove her fist into his solar plexus with the kind of force typically associated with industrial accidents. The sound that followed was difficult to describe. Imagine a freight train hitting a mountain, if freight trains were made of Krillian ambassador and mountains were made of conference room wall. HFY left the ground with all the grace of a sack of concrete mix, traveled approximately 15 feet through the air, and made contact with the reinforced durasteel wall, with an impact that registered on the station's seismic sensors. He slid down the wall slowly, leaving a distinctly ambassador-shaped dent in metal designed to withstand meteor impacts. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet usually found in deep space or inside black holes. Every being in the conference hall stared at the unconscious Krillian, then at Zara, then back at the wall, as if the universe had suddenly decided that fundamental physics were more of a guideline than an actual rule. "Medic," Zara called calmly, straightening her jacket. Ambassador HFY appears to have experienced a kinetic event. High Counselor ZYNTH found her voice first, though it came out as more of a strangled whisper. "How? What? That's impossible." "Is it?" Zara returned to her seat, accepting a replacement stylus from a stunned aide. "Perhaps your preliminary assessments were incomplete." The medical team that responded consisted of 3 different species worth of emergency personnel, each one taking turns to confirm that yes, the 8-foot armored killing machine was indeed unconscious, and yes, he'd been rendered so by a punch from a human female who wouldn't have looked out of place teaching kindergarten. Dr. Helix, the station's chief medical officer, a crystalline being whose species had elevated healing to something approaching art, ran his scanners over the unconscious Krillian with growing disbelief. "Severe concussion, 3 cracked ribs, possible internal bleeding," he announced. "What in the 7 nebulae hit him?" "Cultural exchange," Zara replied mildly. As word of the incident spread through the station's communication networks, the conference hall began filling with curious onlookers. Apparently, news of a human knocking a Krillian ambassador through a wall was a kind of entertainment that transcended species barriers. The crowd that gathered represented a cross-section of galactic civilization, all come to see the mysterious human who'd just redefined the concept of diplomatic immunity. General Klaxon was the first to regain his composure, though his scarred features now carried a distinctly different expression. Where before there had been condescending amusement, now there was the kind of professional interest warriors reserved for potentially dangerous opponents. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we've been operating under some misconceptions about human physiology." "Perhaps," Zara agreed, consulting her notes as if punching alien diplomats through walls was just another item on her daily agenda. High Counselor ZYNTH leaned forward, her ethereal beauty now tinged with something approaching wariness. "Our assessments indicated that Earth's gravity was significantly lower than galactic standard. This should have resulted in reduced bone density, muscle weakness." "Earth's gravity is roughly 1.3 times galactic standard," Ambassador Chen interjected, apparently deciding that classified information was less important than preventing further incidents. "Our preliminary reports may have contained some translation errors." The implications of this revelation rippled through the assembled delegates like a shockwave. If Earth's gravity was higher than standard, that meant humans weren't fragile weaklings struggling to survive in normal conditions. They were powerhouses operating under constant handicap. "Translation errors," General Klaxon repeated slowly. "You're telling me that your species evolved under conditions that would be considered extreme training for our warriors, and we've been treating you like delicate flowers." "The thought had occurred to us," Zara replied. Dr. Helix looked up from his patient, his crystalline features reflecting confusion and growing alarm. "If they are adapted to high-gravity conditions, then their bone density, muscle fiber composition, cardiovascular efficiency." He trailed off, apparently running calculations that were producing increasingly disturbing results. "Doctor." High Counselor ZYNTH prompted. Based on these readings, the average human should be capable of exerting approximately 2.7 times the force of a standard galactic citizen. Their skeletal structure is reinforced to handle gravitational stresses that would cripple most species. Their cardiovascular systems are designed for environments that would require life support for anyone else. He gestured toward the unconscious Krillian. Ambassador Thexval was struck with approximately 15,000 newtons of force. That's equivalent to being hit by a small spacecraft. Small spacecraft, Zara mused. That's rather insulting. I was aiming for medium-sized transport vessel. The crowd of onlookers murmured among themselves, the sound carrying undertones of species-specific alarm calls and what might have been impressed whistling from the Centaurian delegation. Word was spreading through the station's communication networks at light speed, carrying with it the kind of sensational headlines that would dominate galactic news feeds for cycles to come. General Claxon stood slowly, his movements carrying the careful precision of someone who'd just realized he'd been swimming with sharks while assuming they were goldfish. Your military capabilities, he said carefully, may have been somewhat underestimated. You think? Ambassador Chen's diplomatic smile had taken on a distinctly predatory edge. Your projectile weapons, High Counselor ZYNTH added faintly, in the hands of individuals with this kind of physical capability, become significantly more effective, Zara finished. Funny how that works. The medical team was beginning to show progress with their patient. Ambassador Thexval's compound eyes flickered open, focused on nothing in particular for several moments, then fixed on Zara with an expression that might have been respect, or possibly concussion. With Krillians, it was sometimes difficult to tell. The little human, he said slowly, his translator struggling with what appeared to be a completely different set of diminutives than before, hits like a fusion reactor. Thank you, Zara replied graciously. That's the nicest thing anyone's said about my diplomatic style in years. As Thexval was helped to his feet, all six of them, the conference hall's atmosphere underwent a subtle but unmistakable shift. Where before there had been condescending concern for humanity's welfare, now there was something approaching wary respect. The kind of respect typically reserved for species that could punch holes in starship hulls without mechanical assistance. Perhaps, High Counselor ZYNTH suggested delicately, we should revisit our integration protocols. Excellent idea, Zara agreed, making a note. I believe we have several suggestions. The remainder of the conference proceeded along considerably different lines than originally planned. The discussion of protective custody was quietly shelved in favor of mutual defense pacts. The proposed biodomes were replaced with embassy exchanges, and the classification of humans as a protected species was revised to read approach with caution and possibly body armor. Ambassador Thexval, once he'd recovered enough to contribute meaningfully to the proceedings, proved to be a surprisingly effective advocate for human integration. Nothing motivates diplomatic respect quite like being punched through a wall by someone half your size. The humans, he declared during the final session, spotting what his medical team assured everyone was a fashionable head bandage, unnatural warriors. Their entire species has been forged in the crucible of high-gravity combat conditions. To treat them as anything less than equals would be. He paused, searching for the appropriate diplomatic term. Tactically inadvisable. The final accords were signed with considerably more ceremony than originally anticipated. The Terran Integration Conference had become the Galactic Partnership Expansion Summit, complete with formal recognition of human military capability and a carefully worded addendum about the importance of accurate physiological assessments in future diplomatic endeavors. As the delegates filed out of the conference hall, conversations buzzed with speculation about human society, military doctrine, and the disturbing implications of a species that treated multigravity conditions as normal. Several military attachés were already drafting requests for training exchanges, while others were quietly updating their threat assessment protocols. Zara remained behind to finish up paperwork, the same unremarkable human diplomat who'd entered the conference hall that morning. Except now, her unremarkability carried a certain edge. The kind of edge that came with the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones everyone underestimated. Ambassador Chen joined her at the conference table, where she was completing her incident report with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this before. Cultural misunderstanding resolved through direct demonstration, he read over her shoulder. That's one way to put it. Diplomacy is all about finding the right words, she replied, signing the document with a flourish. 3 cycles later, the story had achieved the kind of legendary status typically reserved for mythical heroes and spectacular military disasters. The tale of the human diplomat who'd punched a Krillian ambassador through a wall had spread to every corner of galactic civilization, growing in the telling until some versions involved her taking on entire military units single-handedly. Zara found the exaggerations amusing but unnecessary. The truth was impressive enough. Humanity had gone from galactic charity case to respected civilization in the space of a single conference, all because someone had finally bothered to fact-check their physiological assumptions. The Krillian Empire, not to be outdone, had established a human martial arts exchange program. The Viridians had quietly revised their species interaction protocols to include warnings about deceptively fragile-appearing but functionally enhanced beings. The Morgathi, in a display of professional respect, had offered Zara an honorary commission in their military. She politely declined. Diplomacy, she'd discovered, was considerably more effective when backed by the reputation for casual violence. And in the great irony that governed all galactic affairs, humanity's greatest diplomatic asset turned out to be the very thing that had made them seem helpless, the fact that everyone constantly underestimated them. After all, no one expects the mild-mannered diplomat to punch you into next week. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about assumptions, first impressions, and the importance of accurate intelligence gathering. Humanity had learned that sometimes the most effective diplomacy involved demonstrating exactly why making assumptions about other species was a tactically unsound approach to interstellar relations. Ambassador Thexball, now sporting a permanent dent in his chitinous armor and what he claimed was a fashionable scar, had become something of a celebrity on the lecture circuit, speaking about the importance of cultural sensitivity and proper threat assessment. He always ended his presentations with the same advice: never assume the small, quiet ones can't rearrange your skeletal structure. Sometimes they are just being polite. And somewhere in the diplomatic quarters of Nexus Prime, Zara Voss continued her work, filing reports, attending meetings, and occasionally reminding the galaxy that humanity's greatest strength had always been being underestimated. After all, you never see the punch coming from the person everyone thinks can't fight.